Welcome everybody to Attention Talk Video. We're streaming to you live right now. On our channel, we do we've released a lot of videos over the year. We have a little bit of a rotation. We do a short once a week and we do a video once a week, but we save our live presentations for kind of a conversation around a new field of engineering called cognitive ergonomics from the inside out. There's an existing field of cognitive ergonomics, but this is a paradigm shift. It's by beginning to bring tangibility to the intangible and problem solve like an engineer. And as a result, it actually doubles as a new ADHD intervention. So the thing about paradigms is they change our conceptual understanding of things, and they're very difficult to communicate because of how people's minds are set up. Imagine back in the day when Einstein's general theory of relativity said space and time are curved, and people were like, what? How is that possible? Well, it was proven to be right when they had a solar eclipse in 1919, and the scientific world made some adjustments as a result of that. So what I like doing on these live streams is really talk about some of the outcomes and some of the things that we're learning from the model. There was originally a live stream that we did back in October that defined why I can declare this a field of engineering and why it's different. But since that point in time, we've been taking different pieces of what we've learned from the model and share it with you to kind of help you get your head around it and in part generate a little bit of interest. And so today, really what I want to do is talk about people with ADHD. There's patterns to what you do and there's success in what you do. And sometimes it's not necessarily clear. And one of the things I have found, there's time where people with ADHD, they're successful. And there's other days where they're not successful. And it gets frustrating when you wake up every day and you don't, if the successful you is going to show up or the unsuccessful you is going to show up. In fact, I would argue that it creates a little bit of fear, creates a little bit of anxiety, a little bit of misunderstanding because you don't really know, and uncertainty leads to emotion and rightfully so anxiety. So I wanted to share a few things of the model and talk about some of the things that we've learned. I think it was our third stream that we did on this. We talked about problem solving, and basically there was a table in that live stream where we defined thinking. We use thoughts when we think, but we use thoughts and we think in very different ways. And we really were trying to isolate that ADHD at its core is an executive functioning impairment. Executive functions are a collection of mind tools that you use to solve problem. And we're using that based off of Dr. Russell Barkley. And when these tools are impaired, it makes problem solving impaired. Not daydreaming, not contemplating, not judging, but actually problem solving. And so because they're impaired, there are some intangible accommodations that go along with them that many people don't recognize because they don't understand executive functions because they're intangible. So one of the things that we have talked about is part of executive functions is working memory, and part of working memory is something called verbal working memory, which is basically self-talk. We all have a narrative going on in our head when we're really trying to problem solve. Because that's impaired, many with ADHD actually talk. Neurotypicals will sit and think, talk to themselves inside their head, but we can't hear them. Because people with ADHD, because that's impaired, not to talk is not to think. So they frequently will talk a lot, not realizing that they're actually thinking. I want to reiterate that nobody taught them how to do this. They do it instinctively. So what does that have to do with anything? Well, it's been countless times where I've interviewed people that got diagnosed later in life, let's say in their 40s, and they were very successful in the corporate world, and now they're trying to work out of their house. And they're struggling with what they'll call motivation and or productivity. And when I've been working with them, I'm like, you'll notice is that when you were at the office, did you notice that you didn't have the challenges that you have now? And now you're more challenged. Well, that's difficult for people to see the factual observations because they have a belief that there's no difference. But for those that would look at, oh yeah, I was successful there. Now you're not successful. Why? Well, because As an accommodation, sometimes people with ADHD, they need to talk through things with other people. Like, to talk is not to think. To talk out loud with somebody is to think out loud. Notice in an office environment, when you're having lots of meetings, that you're talking a lot. Sometimes you're talking to the person and sometimes you're thinking to yourself. Only other people can hear it. It's an intangible, but cognitive ergonomics from the inside out brings light on this, sheds a spotlight and suggests that, hey, verbal working memory is impaired. An accommodation is to be able to talk out loud with other people and get feedback on what you're saying. So when I talk about this with people and we start to take a look at the times of their life when they're successful and their times of life where they struggle, what's interesting is a pattern starts to merge. Whenever they're working and interacting with people, they're successful. Whenever they're not, they struggle. Well, what's going on here? Well, again, cognitive ergonomics is to basically put a spotlight on this, is that, hey, people with ADHD, they're very, very intelligent. But often what they need to do is they need to talk out loud and they need to collaborate with other people in order for them to think and be successful. Let's take a look at some of the data that would support this. Dr. Thomas Brown once said many years ago, as the need for independent work increases, ADHD productivity decreases. Well, that makes a little bit of sense in the context of what we're talking about. Also, when the pandemic hit, everybody was sent home from school and from work. People struggled. Why? Because they didn't have other people around that they were collaborating with. It wasn't a motivation problem and it wasn't a productivity problem. It's basically you were working or going to school with other people. You were collaborating with them, which was the accommodation. Intangible, I might add. Now you're home and those people are not around. It's not that you're any less intelligent or your ADHD got worse. What's happening is you're no longer in the environment where you're able to talk through things. If you take a look at that, it really makes a lot of sense. Conversely, there's a number of people that I've coached with ADHD. They get married, they have kids, they have a household, and now the kids are gone, or one of them travels quite a bit, or sometimes there's a divorce. And all of a sudden, their ADHD symptoms sound substantially worse. Now, mind you, as you get older, when you start to hit your 40s, your executive functioning starts to deteriorate, and so does your working memory. Working memory are the thoughts that you're holding right now to solve problems. So yes, there is an argument to say that the symptoms of ADHD get worse as you get older. It's not that your ADHD gets worse, it's just age has an impact on it. But here's where I'm going. A lot of times I'm coaching somebody in their late 50s, 60s, or maybe 70s, and they're living alone and they are struggling far more than they did when there was people around. Well, what's the situational variability? Well, before there was people in the house to talk to. It was built into the area that they're living in. Now they're no longer there. Why? Well, it goes back to what we had said. Not to talk is not to think. So we begin to understand what's going on in the situation. People often want me to coach them to, well, how can I do this on my own? Well, I don't know if you can, because it's an impairment. A lot of people with ADHD really don't want to acknowledge that it's an impairment, but hey, my eyesight is impaired. With glasses, to accommodate those, I'm able to achieve what I'm capable of. A lot of times there's a lot of emotional resistance to this, and as a result, a lot of people just want to stay in their house and try harder, and I really can't think of anybody that I've coached where that's actually worked. Maybe short term, but usually there's some type of human interaction. So they're more subtly kind of thinking out loud. Again, this is kind of what we're illuminating. Let's take this a little bit further. People with ADHD that really have to talk out loud to think, we kind of call them verbal processors. It's not really the best label, but it's kind of what we use in the industry. So a lot of times people will think, oh my God, I can't get anything done unless it's at the deadline. Well, this is a true story. I was coaching a gentleman one time in the business world, and he managed a bunch of people. And literally, when he would show up at work, it's almost like, going to the grocery store where you take a number and you wait in line for your number to be called. I mean, they were just a line out the door. And through his day, there was constantly people come in. He was talking out loud constantly all day long, and he was getting some things done. When he would go home at night, he would bring work home, wanting to work on it, but nothing really got done. Now, busy work would get done, but no real problem solving. In working with the gentleman, we began to own, yeah, I guess I am a verbal processor. Not to talk is not to think. He owned that. One day, he called in, and we're just going through the pleasantries. He's like, oh my God, this has been a really, really, really rough week because I had this huge project. If it wasn't for the deadline, I wouldn't have got it done. And I said, what do you mean deadline? He said, yeah, it was a deadline. It's like, it was the deadline that got it done. And I said, I'm not so sure you're true. That's correct. And I said, what happened? He said, well, I had to grab my team, put them in the conference room, and we had to talk our way through it. I said, well, you spent probably 95, 97% of your time talking to everybody else. And he says, well, I had to. I was the leader. I said, no, you weren't. You were talking out loud. And after a couple minutes, it kind of dawned on him that I was right. Now, I wasn't there, but I just know the guy. And he goes, but Jeff, I can't bring 15 people into a conference room every time I've got to do something. I said, well, if you recognize it, you've been doing it your entire life. Huh? No. He goes, oh, it's like I'm using the deadline to justify it. I said, yes. Now, a lot of people might be having an emotional reaction to this. Like, I can't have groups of people kind of coming together. Well, you can say you can't do that and you can suffer, or you can do it. Now, this particular situation, I don't remember exactly what it was, but he started pulling together what we call this PFC, that was short for prefrontal cortex, which is basically the part of your brain that's in your forehead. But what he told this direct reports, it was the Professional Functional Committee. I don't remember what it was, but he began to do it on a regular basis and really just bringing people in the room and started talking out loud to get some things done. Now, that doesn't look like anything that one could do in the world right now because nobody's really thought about that. Cognitive ergonomics brings credibility to that type of thing and legitimizes that type of accommodation. A couple other small accommodations that are hidden in plain sight is one of the things cognitive ergonomics talks about is when you're going to problem solve or go about your day, you have to familiarize yourself with things. I call this the booting up process. You'd call it getting into the flow. So when you're familiarizing yourself, you can't really work until you load data in your mind. What cognitive ergonomics, it defines this as part of the thinking process. And by the way, it's somewhat effortful to do this. And so for many people, they've got to familiarize themselves with whatever they're doing. Now, let's talk about this. People many years ago would jump in the car and they would drive to work. Well, you're driving to work, maybe listening to the radio, but a lot of times your mind is actually thinking about what you've got to get done that day. You're kind of familiarizing yourself with what's kind of going on. Then when you get work, you've been thinking about it, you're ready for it. During the pandemic, a lot of people didn't have a commute. They would wake up in the morning and they would go to their computer, often to check their emails and find out they had to jump on a Zoom meeting or something. And they found themselves kind of lost and struggling. It's because they didn't have the time to kind of get themselves thinking about what's going into their day. Literally, there was a couple of people that I coached. I suggested that they just get in their car and drive 10 minutes around the block and begin to thinking about their world. It sounds relatively subtle, but cognitive ergonomics not only kind of legitimizes this, it actually kind of shows how it works. So I want to also talk about is that sometimes when you are trying to think about something, having somebody just ask you questions about what you're doing is actually cueing you to actually begin to think about stuff. Often people with ADHD are overwhelmed. When somebody walks up and say, well, what is it you have to do? Believe it or not, asking a simple question like that will help the person identify the task that they need to do, and they'll verbalize it. Once you identify the task, the person can say, okay, with regard to this task, what do you do? What you'd be surprised about is having somebody ask you those questions over a period of time will help you retrieve the knowledge of what you're doing. If you were to write it down at that point in time, then you can actually execute it. Again, it doesn't seem like this is an accommodation, but it's actually helping cue your brain to actually help it think, to externalize it. So I want to bring this to a little bit of a conclusion. ADHD, for most people, they look at it as a focus problem, a concentration problem. Well, when you look at it, that's what it looks like. What cognitive ergonomics recognizes, it's an executive functioning impairment. It's a thinking problem. Again, go back and watch our video on thinking as we define it. It's not daydreaming or worrying or learning or judging or contemplating. It's when you're trying to solve problems, which is multifaceted and ambiguous. If you take a look at planning, decision-making, prioritization, managing time, they're all multifaceted and ambiguous. What the model seeks to do is to identify that you're not executing the plan because of an underlying problem. The underlying problem is a thinking impairment. Get the accommodations, and you'll be surprised at what you do. So if you're the type of person where some days you wake up and you perform, and some days you don't, what cognitive ergonomics does is helps you begin to understand tangibly what's going on, so you can understand the situational variables, like being among people and not, that you need to be in to be successful. At that point in time, the idea is to adjust the environment to fit you, not fit your brain to that environment. That is a completely different approach as opposed to behavioral training, where you're going to condition your behavior to conform to a task. No, you're going to adjust the task to conform to your brain. So with that, I hope that's given you a chance to ponder. I had taken a break on this because I had a lot of other things that were going on. We've got a number of these already scheduled in the next couple of weeks. I hope that you've enjoyed this. If you have any thoughts or questions, please leave a comment. Interested in this, and maybe stuff that you're recognized that we don't necessarily have brought up here. So with that, we hope you've enjoyed this edition of Attention Talk Video. Take care.